Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, all the participants who are attending the Cubin webinar. Welcome to this another webinar organized by the Cubin platform. Today's webinar is focused on making sense of Indian culture and the economic valuation of wastewater reuse and treatment in India. My name is Vasco Barros, and I'm I'm an international consultant of SPI, Portuguese consultancy company based in Portugal, and we are a partner of the Cubin platform together with Hofstede Insights, the consortium which implements the project. As probably most of you have been involved in the past webinars, this is another example of a webinar which is part of the series of webinars which Cubin organizes, which is one of the tools that the project provides in order to having more information and access to internationalize to other emerging economies. Probably also most of you which follow the project know the Cubin stands for Cultural Understanding for Business Expansion and Innovation. Ultimately, the main goal of Cubin is to provide the tools, the necessary tools to support in the internationalization and the entering of other emerging economies, and in this case, India as well. So besides the webinars, Cubin also provides self-assessment tools and document library, which are available on our website. And these are relevant documents which can be consulted in our webpage. As you can see now from the screen, this is an example of our homepage. And from here, you can assess your level of knowledge on different markets. But also have access to detailed information up to 3 levels of information with a more basic, intermediate, and more advanced information of a specific market, and also have the possibility to attend these webinars live or also after they took place because they are recorded and they are available in our website. This webinar in particular will take approximately 1 hour and a half, which will include questions and answers. And we have here today our 2 guest speakers, which will be Mr. Akhilesh Mandal and Dr. Sukanya Das. Just to let the participants know that mainly the participants will, within this webinar, will learn more about the Indian culture, about doing business with Indian partners, as well as the economic valuation of water treatment and its reuse in India. It is my pleasure to just introduce our guest speakers and just briefly present them. So as mentioned, we have Mr. Akhilesh Mandal. He is a managing director of Hofstede Insights in India. Akhilesh has been providing advisory services across a variety of Indian and multinational companies in industry sectors such as IT and manufacturing, and in areas of organizational cultural transformation, building intercultural competence, leading across cultures, and building strong employer brand. On the second part of the webinar, we will have the presentation of Dr. Sukanya Das. She's an associate professor in economics and head of department of policy studies from Terry School of Advanced Studies in New Delhi. Sukanya specializes in environmental valuation and works in the area of water economics and other diverse areas of application in environmental economics. She has also an expertise in economic assessment of investment in projects, measures, policies, and public action programs. So many thanks for both for being here present. I will just like to give a very brief note to the participants, which will be interested and making questions and engaging with the speakers, that you can see from your right hand side. You will have a questions section which will be made in written. So I will be reading out the questions at the end of the session. So we have a dedicated section at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to make your questions during the presentations whenever you feel the need to, and all the questions will be answered at the end. So from my side, without further ado, I will move on the presentation to Mr. Akhilesh Mandal and pass you the floor. I believe that you are currently receiving a notification for presenter, and you should
Thank
be.
You.
Yeah.
I'm putting my screen on. Hopefully it comes up.
Yes, we can now see. Okay, we can now see the presentation. So I will leave Akhilesh to have the presentation, and we can turn off our webcams. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Sure, I needed to just put my screen up there in a slideshow mode. Right.
Maybe on the
Just a
bottom,
moment.
on bottom right,
Yeah.
it's
No,
also or there. Yeah,
I've got it. So is it fine now?
we can see the presenter mode, but with the two slides, sharing the two slides. So with the notes on the side. I don't know if you can change
Ah, that's
uh,
interesting.
this
So
format, maybe under display settings.
okay, so let me just change the stuff to one screen maybe.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that should be fine. Is it good now?
Not yet. Yes, now it is. Now it is. Yeah, it was taking a while.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Perfect. So yeah, the topic today is of course doing business with India, making sense of Indian culture. And before I get there, a quick, I think Vasco did a great introduction of mine. The point I want to mention here is because of my business role that I have played in multiple geographies, it already took me to quite a bit in outside India in terms of moving towards working in the UK, the continental Europe, and of course in India where I have been spending a lot of time, right? So this presentation today, of course, I would be essentially looking at bringing out how do you actually be aware more of culture, right? And what specifically you need to be looking out for when you are dealing with Indian organizations in an Indian setup. I'm just struggling to change my screen here. One second. Okay. My screen seems to have got frozen. Okay. Yeah. So agenda, right? What I'm looking at here, of course, is culture is a very vast topic. And as India, as diverse it is, it's definitely not going to be something that can be covered in 15 minutes of 20 minutes of time. But what I'm going to do is essentially to get you guys a little bit warmed up with a quiz and a case so that you get in the topic. And then look at what are the cultural values and practices that we actually talk about with particular insight onto Indian cultural values, right? And finally, what I would do is I would look at multiple Indian scenarios in a working condition. For example, how does an effective boss expected to behave? How does review meeting happens and what are the direct indirect communications, how do you provide feedback, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty much the agenda that I have. Not too sure whether I would be able to cover all the scenarios, but if not, at least a couple of them. And the deck anyway would be available to the participants, so you can of course refer to the rest of the cases. And of course, finally, after both the sessions, you would have a Q&A where I would try and address any of the queries that you may have already. So here it is. The first one is about this scenario. I hope all of you guys can see it. Now, Saurav's manager, Anna, is very pleased with Saurav's performance. And she says, "You've done very well this last year. You got a bonus. Congrats." Saurav says, "Great, I can now use the money for my sister's wedding." And the question is, what is being expressed here? What kind of Indian values are manifested here? To make your life easier, I've got four choices: extravagance, short term mentality, family orientedness, and work life balance. We take a few seconds for reflections. Obviously, what we are talking about here is family orientedness, right? And as you go forward, you would see India culture is pretty much within the family cluster. And I'll talk about it later on. It's because of the collectivistic society that we live in, right? We just move to the next one here, which is getting into a little bit deeper, which is here is to understand the communication that's happening, right? Rajesh's boss, Anna, is asking Rajesh, can this report be done by next Tuesday? And Rajesh, with all fairness, he replies, yes, yes, I'll try my best. Only thing is that my parents are in town. Now, take a look at this. Here, what is happening is Rajesh is saying something, he's also not saying something, right? Now, there are four options here. Last one is not quite visible, but I'll read it out to you. The first one he says is, I'll certainly get this done by Tuesday, despite the fact that my parents are in town. Second, I'll try to get the report done, but there is no guarantee. Third option is, it is difficult for me. I want you to understand that. And the fourth one, I will not do the report. I pause here a few seconds for you to reflect on. And of course, I would give you the answer, which essentially here is Rajesh is telling his manager, it's difficult for me. I want you to understand that. Now, that's the essence of indirect communication in a collective, very context around communication, right? I get into a case now. All of this is essentially for you to get a flavor of what you can expect in India. And I'm sure if some of you guys have already interacted with Indian organizations, you may have already faced some such situations. I go to the third one, which is a case. Now, look at this carefully. What we call this is, what did we agree on? It's essentially about a German engineering concern, okay, where who has got a software delivery team in India, another project lead who sits in Frankfurt, Alok, the development lead in Delhi. And here is how the conversation goes about delivery. We call this, let's call it, what did we agree on? This is about agreement between two persons, two colleagues. So Anna says, Alok, I think we have gone through everything. The budget's tight, but we have assigned responsibilities and have a tight deadline to start operations, right? All good. Alok says, sure, Anna. Usually we have some delays in the month of June, but we'll try our best. Both of them went back, agreed. Anna understood that Alok has understood the commitment that he has made, and what happens few months down the line when the actual deadline comes 2 days before the deadline. This is what is the conversation. Alok says, Anna, I'm happy to report that we are 80% ready. The budgets were a problem, but I assigned the responsibilities and introduced a reward system to motivate them to get the job done. How do you think Anna responds? She says, she's obviously surprised. She says, 80%? I thought we have actually wanted everything done, and I have committed to my board. Okay, and additional budget? We never talked about this. Now, the point here is both of them got surprised, right? The question that one should be asking one of all of you participants is, are you surprised? Now, if you are, obviously there is a need for you to understand this indirect communication that happens so often in an Indian culture, right? So surprise part is essentially because Anna was unaware of the cultural nuances of Alok, who actually perhaps wasn't quite sure in the first place, and there was no follow up, there was no monitoring that happened in the intervening period. Reflection. Now, this is where what we are looking at is you need to essentially look at multiple scenarios and be aware of. Now, what kind of scenarios do you think one can really come across in India? I'm just going to get my screen a little broadened here. Yeah, it's fine. It is again frozen. Just a minute. Okay. Right. Likely situations that you would confront with in India. I've listed down a few. You may have more. Let's look at some of these. And at the end of the session, you would see whether or not you have a need to actually look at some of these with your culture filter on. So I think my screen is just getting frozen. Yeah. Projects don't proceed as expected. How Indians think and act may look chaotic to you. You're disappointed that Indians don't seem to keep their promises while saying yes. You feel a loss of control over what is happening. Execution of your strategy faces unexpected problems in the country. Understanding the motivation and ensuring the performance of your Indian colleague is always a challenge. So, question is, if this is what it is, how do you go about this, right? We obviously need to be aware of the working practices and the cultural values of a country, right? We need to align them. Now, to be able to understand the values and practices, what they are, let's take a quick look at what do we mean by cultural values and working practices in the language of Hofstede Insights. Kat Hofstede did very seminal research in both the areas, and we have fortunately a way of actually modeling, measuring these, and therefore we are in a position to actually control some of these and make people aware of this. Now, this is a very, very important slide. I won't take too much of time on this, but it's very important for getting some amount of conceptual clarity, right? Now, this is what we call a culture onion, what exactly it is. If you go from outside to inside and start peeling this, let's at the outer layer, you would have things like a symbol. It's a word, gestures, icons, logos in an organization context, right? These are part of an organizational culture. Next level, if you go down, you will have heroes. Heroes of an organization, as the name suggests, are someone you actually role model, right? It could be a promoter of your organization. It could be a founder of your organization. It could be your brand personality, which could be even a celebrity or a cartoon figure, right? The third one, a very important one, are the ritual. How do you meet and greet people? What's your take on people that come inside the organization? Do you accept them easily or you wait for them to perform before you accept them? How customer focused you are? As you see, all of these are very organization specific, and all of this together is the working practices of an organization. We in the Hofstede terminology call this organizational culture. As you go further down, you come to values, and these are not the typical organization values that we are talking about. They are, as you would have guessed, organization values are very business centric, like customer orientation or result orientation, and so on and so forth. These values, and in fact, to avoid confusion, we call them virtues. These are your national culture characteristics, right? Now, these are something that you have been programmed with from the day you are born, the society you have lived in, the culture of a country that you have been working in. So both of these are important. So we are talking about actually two sets of things here, organization culture and the national culture. Today, our focus is going to be national culture. But what I would like to also tell you is, if you look at how do you actually manage national culture, you also need to model this. And this is the model that we use to get around to national culture barriers, cross-cultural communications that we need to make, and so on and so forth. As you see, there are 6 dimensions that we look at every national culture. And in fact, we have mapped about 180 odd countries throughout the world on these dimensions, and we have data points on this. Some of you guys, if you go to our website, you would be able to compare your culture with some other country's culture. Now, these are typical cultural characteristics. What are the 6 dimensions? Quickly, I'll go over them. The first one is, how do you relate to power? Do you accept uneven power distribution, or you think everyone should have the similar amount of power? Second, individualism versus collectivism. Are you stand out? Do you stand out as an individual, or you belong to a societal larger collective group? The third one is a little bit confusing in the name. It's got nothing to do with gender. This is about your motivation towards success, right? Are you achievement focused, or you are more worried about caring for the society? First one is masculinity, caring for the society comes from femininity. And as you would know, perhaps a lot of European organizations, sorry, a lot of European countries are quite on the care for the society side, and whereas, particularly India is towards a masculine society. Uncertainty avoidance, again, it's two negatives. What it means essentially is your love for certainty. The fifth one, long term or short term, how do you relate to time? And the last one is about indulgence versus restraint, right? Now, this is national culture. This is what our focus today is. What you see on the bottom right part of the screen is about organization culture. And as you have guessed, perhaps by now, organization culture is very business centric, right? Are you results oriented? Are you customer oriented? Do you give in to your boss locally, or you talk about a professional culture, right? What's your level of control? Is it an easygoing organization, or a strictly disciplined organization that you have? Is your management approachable or not? Is your organization employee focused or task focused? So all of these are essentially your organization culture that we talk about. The point here is, it's not one or the other. You need to actually look at both for you to understand an organization in a specific national setup. So to summarize, we have national culture characteristics defined by 6D model of Hofstede, and we have organization culture characteristics by the multi-focus model. Our focus today is the national culture, but I want to re-emphasize the point that you need to actually look at both for you to be able to navigate cultural barriers effectively. Now, having said all of these, let's focus straight on to India, right? So how does India figure in this national culture dimensions? As you see, we have those dimensional numbers of 6 of those dimensions I have put on the left side. Now I'll take each one of them quickly for you to see what are the typical characteristics of Indian culture, right? First one, as you see, power distance. Now, just to tell you, each one of these scales is 0 to 100. In other words, as you are going up, as you see on the first one, India is 77, which means we are a fairly hierarchical top-down society. Our real power is centralized. Our communication is top-down. And we rarely offer negative feedback up the ladder. The power holder is not quite used to listening into negative feedback. Now, I must caution you here, these are all typical national culture characteristics. Would there be exceptions? Yes, there would be many exceptions as you see we are getting into more egalitarian society for us worldwide. But for a group of people as Indian, you could fairly say that this is a hierarchical culture. Second one is individualism. As you see, anything less than 50 is lower on that. Larger than 50 is greater than 50 is higher on that. For example, if an individualism score less than 50 means we are leaning more towards a collectivistic society. So India is a collectivistic society. As I said, the third one is about our motivation towards achievement. We are fairly achievement focused, and we like getting appreciated. We like to get rewarded by material gain. Okay, though there is a downward pull because of the spiritualism that pervades the country, but quite clearly we can say, quite confidently we can say that we are a fairly masculine society driven by achievement or success. Uncertainty avoidance, yes, it's low. What it means is our love for certainty is low, right? Which means we accept imperfection. Unplanned activities, things going beyond the schedule or beyond plan, doesn't quite surprise us as much as a Western European perhaps would react this to, right? There is a term in India called adjustment. If and there is a saying which is nothing is possible in India if you know how to adjust. I'll go to the next one, which is not of much relevance today because in an Indian context, because there is no dominant preference in Indian culture on long term or short term. If you go to China, yes, it's a very long term society. Indulgence is the last one, and no prizes for guessing. India is culturally restrained by social norms, perhaps due to religion influence. We believe that overintelligence is somewhat wrong. We consider it somewhat wrong. So this is what Indian cultural values, characteristics are. To summarize, and this is important because when you look at some of the scenarios, I think we should be looking at this Indian culture in this way, right? We are hierarchical, we are collectivistic, we are towards achievement focus, and therefore we like material gain, and we are fairly comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty, etc. And lastly, I'm skipping the long-term orientation part, we are a restrained society, which means we're not very demonstrative in our expression, behavior, and so on and so forth. That's the summary of India. So now when you look at next, what we are going to do is we'll see how do these manifest themselves in terms of the behavior expectations and how one should be behaving with keeping in mind these Indian cultural values. What I plan to do is I actually have multiple scenarios here, and they are effective boss. How does an effective boss expected to behave? How is an effective boss expected to behave? How should one be conducting a review meeting? How does one manage conflict situations? How do you provide feedback? And finally, how do you actually look at change management? Now, what I plan to do is I have all these scenarios. At least some of these I do have cases, but what I will do is I'll just take two of this, the effective boss and review meeting in the interest of time, and see a scenario and let's figure out for ourselves what exactly it expected and what went wrong. Now, I just leave you here for a couple of seconds, maybe 10 seconds for you to go through this because it's on the screen. I'm assuming things are visible. This is about an American professor's expectations of his younger colleague, younger lecturer in India. I'm leaving you for a couple of seconds to read this. So net is the Indian colleague actually was not someone who was prepared for the workshop. And of course, that surprised the Americans very much, and they were baffled at such lack of responsibility. Once again, this doesn't happen always, but I'm only talking about a typical scenario, and actually, this was a real scenario. The point is, what went wrong? See, John did not follow up with Parul and team closely. That's very important, right? Did not support them, so they felt they could do the work and guide them to what to do, right? Now, before I come to the last one, in India, a boss is expected to be directive as much as supportive. In other words, if you are giving certain assignments to your team member, it's also you are expected to ensure the team member is indeed supported to be able to execute this as the right capabilities. A, B, you respect in India what is actually inspected. What we believe, what it means is you need to do a follow up with your team member closely to figure out whether or not someone is actually stuck and provide the necessary support. So you're directive as well as supportive, right? You got to guide them. The most important part here is while all this happened, even Parul was expecting as an immediate manager, he would protect her from the big boss, right? So that's the kind of expectation. You as a manager, you're supposed to be very supportive of the you know buffer you from the environment. At the same time, you provide right direction and build up capability. It's a very important thing for Indian organizations context. Let's look at a review meeting scenario, right? It's a different type of case wherein, let me just read this out for you. Paul was warmly welcomed by his local representative Rahul in India, who had been preparing grounds for a major emergency response exercise in the country. They soon got down to business and Rahul briefed him on the progress. When Paul asked him about the availability of the site they had always used earlier, Rahul assured him that they have been informed and that there was no problem. And Paul visited the site by himself. He was informed by the site owner that they were always welcome. However, Rahul hadn't communicated the exact date with them. Now imagine the scenario. Paul obviously was flabbergasted with the lie he was told by Rahul, his Indian manager, Indian representative. The question is, what was Paul's realization, right? Here is it. His meeting conversation with Rahul has been flawed by indirect and direct communication pattern. He had not read the air. Now, what exactly does it mean? His rep had not visited the emergency site himself. However, having always been welcomed at the site, he preferred to answer that there was no problem, which of course was far from reality. So the point here is what could have Paul done differently? And that's a reflection point, right? I would allow you guys to reflect for a couple of seconds before I unfold what actually could have been done and what is normally done in an Indian scenario. Think. So how do you go about it? When you say reading the air, what does it mean? It means that you need to ask open-ended questions such as, shall we go to the requirement list the location has provided to you? And I'll tell you why are you looking at open-ended question, okay, not a direct yes or no answer, right? Questions such as this, questions such as what do the locations need from us? So get into this by going around the context of it so that you can assess for yourself the readiness. Summarizing is important. So when you say, so I understand you are welcome, there are no other parties requiring access to the location. What is happening here is you are asking this indirect question because in a collectivistic society, saying no is very difficult because if Rahul hasn't done it at the same time, he doesn't want to put his superior to shame. So therefore, and we call this giving face. You give face and build in flexibility to avoid loss of face. So you're asking around this essentially for Rahul to be providing the answer, therefore you can assess. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through I will not run through the rest of it. I'm going to skip these parts, okay? Quickly, I've got scenarios for conflict, feedback, and all of that. But what I want to get onto here is to summarize is that, to look at and be effective in an Indian context, you need to be aware of this. You need to be aware of the national culture as much as the organizational practices. Both of these together, and there's no shortcut, there is no quick answer to this. The awareness comes as you keep working on this and as you start looking at your own culture compass with respect to the Indian culture. If you don't do that, what happens? This is what happens. I'm going to leave you with this particular picture. Okay. You actually see the world through your own filter. So you continue to see it through your own filter. And most of us are fairly unknown about our own filters. Okay. And therefore, cultural awareness is key for working in any country, particularly characteristics of India, which is far different from Western Europe or Northern America. I stop here and pass it onto Vasco and the next speaker. And of course, I'll come back at the end to take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akhilesh. It was indeed a very interesting presentation, very detailed and very descriptive, which I believe was for sure interesting for all the participants. I will now move on the presentation to Dr. Sukanya, which should now be the presenter of the webinar. Just please confirm that you can share your screen. Yes, we can see it. And let me also just take the chance to reinforce the participants to be free to make your questions in the question section, which will be answered at the end. So please feel free to make the questions whenever you want, and we will answer them at the end. So please, Sukanya, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, are you able to view my screen? So
yes.
is it in which?
It is not in slide show mode. It's yeah, it's in presentation, not in presentation mode.
Is it fine now?
Yeah. Now it is. Yes. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Today I will be presenting in the aspect of the economic valuation of the wastewater treatment and reuse in the context of India. Yeah. So as we start for, so as it is, this session is a bit of a technical session. So some of the terminologies we will be coming up. So that is in a way needed to as we proceed further for this particular presentation. So before we start up with the context of the wastewater, we should also know about like what really we think about water as an economic good. So when we come to the aspects of like defining water as an economic good, we see that how far we can make an efficient and equitable allocation of the water among the competing users, both within our present generation as well as with our present as well as the future generations. Because the thing is that we have to see from the perspective of the sustainability. The next thing that we have to look across is of the efficient and the equitable infrastructural investment. That is in maybe when we are, as water is an economic good and it is scarce, so we have to really see that how equitable and efficient will be the infrastructure for that particular good should be. Second, then it comes for the aspect of the efficient degree of the treatment of the wastewater. So after we do this of the aspect of the efficiency in the aspect of the wastewater, then finally we see for the different sorts of the instruments that will be we designed for, starting from might be the way how we are looking for the water pricing, taking into aspects of the property rights, taking to the aspect of the different types of the water tariffs and taxes. So wastewater as a resource. So when before we just address to from the economic dimensions, we have to see that why we are thinking about of wastewater as a resource. So as maybe in the there's a lot of depletion of the groundwater, and we see that wastewater and the reuse, it is emerging as an alternative of the great future, which allows us in increasing the supply of the water resources, and it in a way solve a lot of our pollution problems. So in the recent decades, with the technological progress in the field of wastewater generation, we find that maybe a lot of the, maybe when we are thinking about the feasibility of the reuse projects, they all has to be subject to any sort of an economic assessment. But still, interestingly, the point is that though several sort of the wastewater reuse projects are coming up, still we find that when we are addressing this economic aspects, the list is addressed to the aspect of the overall benefits and the cost, but we are narrowing down to the aspect of only the private cost, while the external effects are mostly being regulated about the aspect of the advantages of the water reclamation and the reuse. So in that way, when we do that sort of the economic aspects evaluation, we end up in having the true benefits and the costs which have not been properly evaluated. So thus we see that this valuation of the benefits in a way will help us in making an efficient decision about the management of the water resources. And the construction of the wastewater treatment plants, when we think about of the substantial investment, because as we know, this sort of the installation of this plant and the type of the technology associated with the whatever the different types of the technology, taking into account of the contextual issues, taking into account of the cost aspect, taking into account of the technical feasibilities. So whatever the different types of the technologies we put forward, so we have to, the lot of thing is not only from the aspect of the installation, but of like the operation and the maintenance cost, that which has to be spread about of the over the number of the years. The problem comes up from the aspect, because all these wastewater projects, the whatever might be the benefits and the cost, they are not exchanged in the markets. So the total economic value helps us in identifying the different markets and the non-markets value that can be derived from wastewater reuse projects. So the question now comes up like from the common man's perspective. So is it possible to derive the economic value? Yeah, we can do that. So it is that the recycled water, as we can see, as it is a it has an economic value, and so for that reason, whatever might be the society we are living up, we should aim in having a reliable price at an efficient allocation. So coming to the context of the reclaimed wastewater, we see that we are nowadays using it directly. Maybe when we are thinking from the user's value, so we using it for the irrigation. So it might be considered as a private good, and for that it has a market value. But however, if you could see from the perspective of the different types of the environmental purposes, suppose if we think we like to have an enhanced water quality, like in the context of India, we are having several now the Namami Gange scheme is there. So different types of the clean water projects for the river Ganga is coming up over the years. And if we are going to measure for that, so how in a way we will be thinking about? So because we are perceiving the benefits, we like to have an enhanced quality of the water. So sometimes it becomes very difficult from the maybe layman's perspective until and unless we go and measure for these values. So it becomes difficult to quantify all those ecosystem services that we derive from those type of environmental goods. So if we try to define this total economic value, what it is all about. So in a way, when we try to go forward in defining that, we see that it recognizes the two basic distinctions between the value that individual derive from using the environmental resource or the use values, and the value that individual derive from the environmental resource, even if they themselves do not use it, or the non-user values. Like when you are directly having the consumptive uses, then you are having the user values. When you are not using it, like suppose I am living in Delhi, but I care for River Ganga. So they are but in a way, and I am willing to have a more clean water for that particular river. So those are the non-use values which I like to quantify and to measure for. So the use values, it can be distinguished into the direct and the indirect, depending on what type of the valuation we are going for in quantifying for them. And the non-usual values are the values that individuals may derive from the environmental resources without even personally using or intending to use them. So in the context of wastewater, you can think about like the consumptive use of the treated wastewater as one of the aspects where you are from the irrigation, where you are having the direct user values. From the perspective of an improvement of the water quality of a river, you can see from the lens of the direct user values. The option values are something like when you are not only leaving something, that when you are not fully exhausting a resource, like as we all know that we keep on depleting our natural resources, but it has to be also sustained for our next generations. So if you are trying to have an option to live in the future, so given the current level of the treatment, current level of the quality of that particular good, so then you are defining that as an option value. So for the treated wastewater, we see that user value can be derived from also these indirect uses. For the non-user values, we can think about under three categories. Like we can think about from the perspective of the existence, that is at the particular point of time, what is the existence, what is maybe how is that particular type of the good. So in that, here we can see from the perspective of the wastewater, it is the value the individuals may place upon the treatment of the wastewater, even if it will never be directly used by themselves or by future generations. For the bequest, you are leaving an opportunity for that to be used by your future generations. And the altruistic value is the one where, in fact, the treated wastewater in question should be available to the others also in the current generation. So how capturing this total economic value is crucial to policy and the management decisions. Like if we are a policymaker, so how this type of the valuation will in a way help us. So the first thing is that it will help you in guiding for the resource allocation among the water resource conservation, because in our context of a developing country, we need to always go for an efficient allocation of our resources because resources are scarce. And in that way, we have to also do in a way in a sustainable manner, and we should also see for the socially valuable endeavors, and thus enabling the society to allocate its scarce economic and environmental resources in an efficient manner. Also, establishing the total economic value would also assist in the design of economic incentive and the institutional arrangements, and help to identify the potential gainers and the losers from the current depletion and the degradation of the water resources. So the better you are having the value, the better you can think of the designing different sort of the economic instruments, or what type of institutional arrangement you like to plan for that particular good in your country. So this schematic, in a way, is showing us the aspect of the benefits that we can have from the sanitation and the wastewater treatment. So as you can see, the direct impacts are quite large, taking into account of the improved hygiene, reduced water pollution, and it ranges, the usual benefits, it ranges from a lot of aspects, taking into account of the less incidence of maybe suffering from water-related diseases. We are having cleaner water bodies. We are having better employment profit for the local economic and increasing the capacity. Also, in that way, for the provision of the resources, so we are having taking into account of the reduced cropping costs through the savings of the fertilizer. We can think of reducing the pre-treatment costs for the downstream wastes, as well as there are a lot of the byproducts like the biofuel. So as we are not going in more a technical session today, so given the different types of the methodologies of the valuations that exist, and we can see that there are an array of the benefits that we can look for, we can measure for, given the different types of the valuation methods that exist into this into this context of finding the economic for the economic valuation, or to finding the total economic value of any environmental good. And here we are talking in the context of the wastewater. So as you can see, there are different types of the methodologies. There are different types that we use for, and in that way, we will be able to address the different sort of the benefits that is coming up from the wastewater. So if you could look to the aspect of the provision of resources, we see that if we look to the reduced cropping cost to the saving of the fertilizer, instances has been found out that really we can, studies have shown and they have done that. And one particular study in the context of the Indian Central Pollution Control Board, they have calculated the annual loss of nutrients which was discharged in the unused into the sea. So the amount, as you can see, is pretty high, and that is a 2009 figure. There are options also in addressing for the reduced pre-treatment cost for the downstream users, and here you can see for using the finding the total economic value across from cleaning up of the river cleanup programs. And there also we find that studies has been done in the context of India. A lot of studies has been done, and mostly focused on the river Ganga, because as we know that starting from the 1985, the first Ganga Action Plan came up for cleaning up of that particular river. And several studies have tried to address over the years to find that really how far is the benefit that we are really accruing from the amount of the cost that has been put forward for that particular project. So in that way, our study was also done in 2000, and they had calculated that if you are seeing for the different levels of the water quality, like you are going from the worst to that of the best. So here we find that the stakeholders, they're really having a willingness to pay for the different level of the water quality. And the study was done across India in 23 cities with a population of the 1 million, and the willingness to pay was found to be around 8.7 million. It came up to the attributable to the 8.7 million households from the literate population. So similar type we can maybe implement to any type of river cleanup programs. We can implement in providing an estimate for the policymakers for any sort of a river cleanup programs. Also, as I was talking initially when we started the discussion, that as the groundwater level is thoroughly depleting and water is scarce, so we keep on looking for the aspect of the wastewater treatment and the reuse options. So in that angle, studies has been done in the context of India. And there also we find that interestingly, really the response, that is the consumers, that is the people residing in the households, they are really willing to pay a significant amount in terms of the higher monthly municipal taxes to ensure the full capacity of the sewage treatment plant is used for primary treatment, and the technology is upgraded to enable the secondary treatment. So they're willing for an upgradation, not only from the technological upgradation, but also to the volume or the capacity of the treatment plants. So thus we can see that the tax, so the question that I was telling you, that how that can be sustained. So initially might be someone can, maybe some sort of a PPP model is coming up and someone is installing a treatment plant. But what about the long run? Who will bear the maintenance cost and the long run running cost? So it has been thought of like the tax revenues that is coming up along with an add-on with the municipality taxes that might sometimes maybe if the municipalities alone is not able to have the cost recovery, so the coming up from the sharing of the cost from the respondents, we can really be able to sort this problem out. The next aspect comes up maybe when might be for the wastewater. We also know that there are a lot of the byproducts. So one byproduct is of the biofuel. And there we have also seen that maybe economic valuation has been done, some studies has been done. And one recent studies we had done in Delhi of one of the treatment plant, that is pre-installation. If you're doing this sort of the study, it becomes easier for you to have to taking into account of the capacity, how big the capacity of that treatment plant is all about, and what level of, what is the amount of the biomethane gas that that the plant can maybe emit, and depending on that we can think about of addressing some market incentives and to come up with some solutions. So here we have seen that here we have seen the study have seen that to look to the aspect of whether the biofuel that produced within the sewage treatment plants, they can be marketed as a cooking fuel. And it was estimated that the average willingness to pay for that compressed gas is equivalent to 14.2 kg LPG in calorific value, and it was around rupees INR value of 340. The study also found that if we are going to market that gas for cooking, it is economically viable. And if someone is investing in that project, so from it is observed that from the third year onwards, the investor can expect a revenue which will be around rupees 100 per methane cylinder. 33% of the respondents they favor switching to the compressed biomethane gas for cooking. But still we find that as the information across the sector is very less, so there is sometimes the aspect of the barrier that come up is of the lack of trust in the technology for the social acceptance of the biofuel. Agricultural reuse is predominantly being carried out in quite a few places in India for wastewater. And in that way, we have looked for one study that we have done in the Coimbatore. So why we have done in Coimbatore, because Coimbatore is a drought-prone area where it is a hard rock region. So the people are not always, the farmers are having a scarcity of the options for the water. So there we have seen that the farmers who are on the overexploited blocks, they are in a way having an acceptance for using that particular water, and we came up with their sharing of the cost through this contingent valuation survey. Similar results are also observed in the Hyderabad from the Musi River. So thus we can see that in what way we can just put from the policymaker's perspective. So depending on the type of the farmers, the size of the treatment plant that you will be installing about, and the farmers' contributions, how much they can fund of the operational cost. So maybe we can think about of coming up to this sort of installing this type of the treatment plant and also sustaining it over the years. If you can see from some of the social benefits to this particular wastewater sector, so we should not be able to just ignore the aspect of the water sanitation and the hygiene. So here we can see that studies has shown that people are willing to pay for the toilet building programs. They, in a way, are deriving the economic value through the willingness to pay for building toilets, or you can have the community toilets. And quantifying for the health impacts will facilitate in designing the policies for eliminating the open defecation and resulting in the minimum suffering from the water, less suffering from the waterborne or water-related illnesses. But as we know that given any sort of the methodologies that we go for, so when we're trying to derive from this economic valuation for the wastewater, there also we find that there are limitations in regard to the aspect of finding out across the different methodologies, because several methods have their own way to go for. The problems comes up in regard to that what quality of the data that we are getting across the different sectors. The second problem is in regard to of, as it thoroughly depends a lot of the primary survey. So how far the enumerators are capable enough to get maybe the true data from the respondents. From the quantification of the health aspects, we find that there are sometimes less accuracy in the context of the data that is coming from the hospitals in regard to for the disease and the occurrences of those diseases. And sometimes we find that on that way, this type of the methodology regarding the cost of illness or like that, it suffers from those types of the limitations. But to be very frank, the more you are able to quantify for these benefits that you are aggregating, the higher the uncertainty will be. So how India is working across and taking into account of all these dimensions in the economic side in the wastewater sector. So in the Indian wastewater sector, we find that there are several sort of the organizational models and which are adjusted to the different forms of the ownership depending on the type of the infrastructure, the scale of the area, and the type and the amount that you are able to invest, that is the investors are able to invest for. So now people are going to, because a lot of promotion has been going for in the Indian context now, so shift that there is a paradigm shift to the decentralized wastewater treatment. So in that has been facilitated over the years, and nowadays in the urban areas and the peri-urban areas, the housing complex has made mandate to have this sort of the decentralized wastewater treatment. Also, we find that in the recent years, previously it was not, the private cost was given much importance, but now inclusiveness has come up into this sector, and it has been also being maybe attempted by the policymakers, and they are internalizing the economic value of water, considering the environmental costs of its use in several purposes. So the current policies that is being existing, they coordinate the provision of the water services through a mix of the instruments. That is, one type of instrument doesn't work, but it works with several sort, with that of a command and control. And in that way, but mostly it end up in having the end users as the price takers. Taxes and tariffs, they provide the information for the decision making, mostly about the consumption. And in that way, their preferences show up in their willingness to pay for a certain level of the service, where the consumers who are willing to subsidize a decentralized wastewater treatment to cover at least their non-potable water uses. So that sort of an example we have seen in the context of Delhi by this particular study, where a sharing of the cost, maybe the people are ready to just go for setting up a decentralized wastewater treatment plant. So in that way, if we can go by that, the government can introduce the subsidy schemes for the households who participate in the types of the conservation. And we know in the Indian context, rainwater harvesting, we are going in the similar way of incentivizing the households who are adopting that. We can also think of co-funding leads to some sort of the reduction in spending by the government, and it would be interesting to try and to assess whether the subsidy can be constructed that leaves everyone at least as better off as before. Potential, so we find that if we can think about like people will be having an interest when they see that there is a potential savings in their water bill, and it might be in Delhi we have maybe this sort of a scenario has already worked nicely, and thus we can find that this sort of the decentralized wastewater treatment, which is slowly getting more importance, if that sort of a cost sharing mechanism can be worked about, so we can think about that can be economically viable. So when we are addressing the wastewater disposal from the distribution, so we see that it is not from only the treatment plant we have to look across. We have to see from the entire distribution system, and also we have to also see that what is the quality of that particular system of the treated wastewater. So if an infrastructure that we are having, so we should not be only happy to that of a plant, we are building up a plant, we are happy with that. So we should also see that the entire distribution system, how it is all about. So if an infrastructure is not economically sustainable, so as the systems of the billing, revenue collection, and the enforcement, they will become inactive, then the actual prices for the service may not reflect the full supply cost. So for that cases, we might see that no, there will be no investment to maintain, repair, or build infrastructure, and would result in a low level of service provision. And this sort of a thing we have also been observing into several of our particular major cities. So lower service lead to additional cost for the household, like that willingness to pay and that amount that time will not be able to be viable enough. So it is an add-on burden to the households, and such cost for a dual supply system to supplement the pipe water or the lesser quality or higher running cost is needed for that on-site municipal wastewater treatment. So for the cost recovery, mostly we have seen that from the user's perspective, they are the one who are taking the most of the burden. So it has been done through the aspect of either the form of the tariffs or the taxes that the municipality is collecting, or sometimes we can see a combination of both we can think about. To ensure the sustained cost recovery and efficiency, service delivery decision makers need to make an investment choice that are financially and operationally sustainable. A financial model is that one that has to be built about in chalking out for the long-term strategic plan in order to match the engineering design. So we should not only think about a technology transfer and to be just installed. We have to only think for the long-term strategic planning of before we adopt that sort of an engineering design, and we should also think of the cost with financing and what about the consumer's perspective and their willingness to pay to sustain that. And it will in a way will help us in ensuring the choices of the consumers in regard to the level of the improvement they need for the wastewater treatment and reuse and available financing, as well as for the cost recovery that we are having from the tariffs. Otherwise, even if we just implement different types of the tax, it will not be sustained for a longer duration. So the framework would be useful if we could put forward. We like to have this sort of the framework for implementation, which takes into consideration the choice across the different stakeholders and the application of the cost benefit analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukanya, for the very detailed presentation, and for sure our innovation component of our webinar, which is I believe is a hot topic also within the Indian culture and environment. I will now then open the floor to the questions which we have received so far. Let me just also turn on my webcam and also check for the questions which we have under the webinar. I believe also the sharing of the presentation is still with Sukanya, and I'll make myself presenter. Okay, so I believe you can also see this slide for further information. So I would like just to go quickly over the questions which we have received. I would like to start with Akhilesh, and a question we have received from one of our participants is the following: do you see any relationship between the characteristics of Indian national culture and the level of innovation?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So there are a couple of things here. The most important part here is if you had seen Indian national culture with respect to uncertainty avoidance, right? What it means is one isn't quite uncomfortable handling ambiguous scenarios, surprises, and so on. In a context of an organization, it also means that there is willingness to try. There is willingness to try, and of course, if you are trying, you fail. Now, the important part is while culturally it could be national culturally, it could be supportive enough, organization culture comes in the play there, right? Every trial and consequent error has its own cost. What you also need to consider is in an organization in the Indian context, while national culture supports it, your organization could be extremely cost conscious, right? It could also say that, look, it's okay to fail, but however, if you fail, I am going to be pinning into the wall. So both these needs to get considered. To summarize, for a national culture perspective, because of our low uncertainty avoidance score, we are naturally innovative, always trying to improvise solutions, and there is a relationship that to innovative trials. However, your organization culture can come in the way. I hope I've addressed this question of yours, but it's a good
Yes,
question.
thank you very much. Very clear, at least from my point of view, and I hope it has been clarified for the participant who has made a question. Sukanya, I have a question also here regarding your presentation, and it's a quite specific question, and I apologize in advance in case I don't say a name of a city or a town correctly. But the question is, hilly areas in India like Darjeeling is known to have actual water shortages. To your knowledge, what steps have been taken to remedy this problem? And also, a complement to that, how is wastewater management different in hilly regions like Darjeeling compared to plain lands like Bihar?
Yeah. So thank you for the questions, but typically might be here as I am an economist rather than that of a maybe geology based person. So the terrain and the other details like the climatic or the those details on which the plant varies and the different types of the treatment plant keeps on changing across. So that in a way it varies, and that in a way is mostly to applicable to the aspects of the hydrology, so the civil engineer, so they will be much better of position to answer that. But coming up to the aspect of the water scarcity, we see that the wastewater reuse and the treatment options can be, it is not different from the aspect that if we are trying to put forward in the context of like a hilly area to that of Bihar. So the terrain, difference in the terrain is an issue taking into account of how the plant is to be built about. But in a way we have seen in our projects, like we have seen several treatment plants that is being there in the Uttarakhand, and we have, but mostly this taking into account of the terrain and taking into account of the land size that on which you will be planning about. So you have it generally these plants are a sort of a decentralized plant, so you cannot have a bigger plant there. But maybe what the aspect that I have covered is mostly from the sustaining those plants after you put forward for the technologies. And here the technologies also keeps on changing, that on depending to the aspect of like the geographical conditions, as well as to the aspect of the cost, that is, and how will you be sustaining that type of technology. So there are several uh, maybe specific things that need to be looked across for an installation to the for a plant, but sustaining that, and there are different ways that it goes for of sustaining that types of the plant, depending on how big you are making the plant, and how you're thinking of from the aspect of the cost recovery, and from the sustainability perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your view. Even though maybe it would be running out a bit of the scope of your work, but thank you anyways for your input. Another question coming back to Akhilesh, which I would like to have your view on this, is, in your opinion, what is more critical, the organizational culture or the national culture? Take into account we're talking about India, which has a very strong culture associated to it. So what do you believe is more critical in your opinion?
Again, it's a very good question. See, if you remember my culture onion, right? You have the outer three layers of organization culture, which are essentially working practices. And the inner core of that is national culture. What it also means is national culture pervades, regardless of the organization, typical organization and an organization practices. So let's take an example of an organization. If you can move this from, let's take a multinational, right, which has got offices in multiple countries with diverse culture. If you move this from one country to another, you may like to have your organization culture with respect to similar working practices, but a national culture would influence this, right? So, and the national culture comes right from the day you are born and have been living this in the society till such time you come into your professional life. In other words, you are programmed quite strongly with national culture, whereas more you move from one organization to another, you get into different working practices. So to kind of come to a shorter answer to this, national culture overrides to an extent organization culture, right? Because that's all pervading. An Indian, even if I move from India, let's say, to another, one organization to another, or one country to another, I carry with me the national culture stuff. However, organization culture, some of them could be very strong. For example, I personally come from IBM. IBM always had a very strong culture, but if you look at IBM in India and IBM in US, they could be two different things because of the variance of national culture, right? So national culture is very all pervasive. It kind of overrides organization cultures, but then again, some places organization culture could be very enforcing for you to actually change your national practices too, right? So long answer short, it's a mix with national culture overriding organization culture to an extent.
Okay, thank you very much. This is actually, I believe, a very good question and answer, which would, in my opinion, would lead to another question, which is related to another form of internationalization and entering a market, which is probably not the most common, but one of the most common ways to approach a new market, which is through a merger and acquisition process. Having this in mind, and the difference between the organizational culture and national culture, and one prevailing more than the other, for someone interested in moving ahead with an M&A procedure, how would you believe? How do you feel would be the best approach to be successful and effective in this way?
Again, another very good question. See, we have done multiple M&A scenarios where, and even if we haven't worked on some of these, there are many M&As have failed, not because of the fact that as a business deal they were imprudent, but because of the non-alignment between two cultures. And we have multiple examples. You have Renault, Nissan, you have Daimler, Chrysler. There are n numbers. Now, therefore, what it means is while an, a strong culture actually merges or acquires another, while the working practices of both these can be brought together and you can get the best out of this, which is the organization culture working practices, which is also important. The national culture integration is key. And we are actually had been working on many organizations, perhaps over hundreds and even thousands, where we have seen that national culture, particularly in M&A scenario, becomes extremely key. Okay, recently we were working with an Indian organization merging with or acquiring a small Dutch outfit. And the first thing that they were talking about is the national culture integration. How do these two nationalities work together in doing a product design, in going to market, and so on and so forth? So it becomes extremely key that one looks at the national culture as much as it's important that you also look at consolidation of your working practices, which is relatively simpler. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Much clearer, and thank you for the detailed answer. Sukanya, I would like also to come back to you, focusing more also on the presentation and the main topic of the session, which is the economic valuation. And my question here would be, what do you believe is the main added value of conducting an economic valuation in the context of developing countries? And at the same time, how does this help policymakers? So basically a two-in-one.
Yes, thank you for the question. So we find that as we know that in the context of the developing countries, so the resources are scarce. So taking into account of the given the resources scarce, and we need to allocate that efficiently. So before we do that, if we cannot do any sort of evaluation exercise and we directly jump up in allocating budget for that particular resource, or if we could just implement any sort of an instrument, policy instruments, or maybe, so it will end up in inefficiency in the whole system. So for that reason, there is always an importance to have to do an economic valuation. And as I was also discussing that sometimes when we perceive the usual values, we keep on pricing the private, we keep on just putting a price tag on the private benefits or the cost. But we don't even think about the one that we are not using, but we are getting the benefits from those types of the resources, and which has to be, because it doesn't, because any of our environment good, they are free goods and they doesn't have any market. So as there is no market, we always think that they are free and we can in a way deplete that resource to a maximum extent. So for that reason, the valuation taking into account of that non-usual part has to be included. And if we do that, and different sort of the techniques that I was speaking about, we will be seeing that the value itself is quite large. And given that it will help us in having an overview that what really the different stakeholders ranging from the households to that of the policymakers to that of the investors, so different stakeholders, what is the perception? And it will be much easy for us to move the story forward, and that will be much needed also in the context of developing nations.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe it's much clearer the importance and the reason to have this this economic valuation to better understand what should be done. And I think that we should be basically finishing off in the best note possible. We are actually on time, and we have answered the questions for our participants. So at least from my side, I would like to once again thank you for the availability for both the speakers to be here and to sharing your knowledge and experience in your both fields of expertise, which we highly appreciate. And once again, we would, of course, be very much interested in collaborating in the near future in other endeavors. And once again, thanking to all the participants who have attended and benefited from this webinar. I hope it was useful with very diverse topics, but both very relevant and important at this point, since we are also facing many difficulties and dealing with a lot of limitations due to the whole pandemic. I hope this initiative has been useful to all of the attendees. And once again, please feel free to all the participants and speakers to follow up our activities under Cubin, all our social networks and the platform, which we have a lot of interesting information available there. Once again, thank you very much for your participation and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Bye bye.